forward. Okay, Erev Tov. We're here tonight for our final class of the first semester. We did modern times, but like the first part of modern times. From the beginning of modernity through basically roughly the 1900s. And things change drastically and continue to change drastically from the end of the 1900s until today. And that will be next semester. Now, at the end of last class, we had Joseph, okay, who wrote on WhatsApp that he may not be able to participate tonight because he's traveling. I think he said he went from Canada to Florida or something like that. So he said he might not be here. And I said, well, that's too bad because the class is going to start with you. Okay, the class is going to start with the point that he made last week, which was a good point. And it's also a point that tells us something about this course. Okay, last week we did the beginning of academic Jewish studies, which began in Germany in the 19th century. And you all remember, of course, that it's called Wissenschaft des Judentum.
Oh, I'm going to remember that for sure.
So I gave you two of the big figures, you know, in that movement. Leopold Zuntz, who was a buddy, if you remember, with Avram Geiger of the Reform movement and the head of the seminary, and also Heinrich Gretz, who was the great Jewish historian. And there are other figures too, besides the two of them. But they're two of the stars, and you know, we're not here to study in depth everything that happened. We're here to get a flavor for what was going on. And these two figures, you know, they give you a flavor. Okay. Now, I told you at the very beginning of this course that I have no credentials. Remember? Or did you forget that already? And you think I have credentials. I have no credentials to teach this course. Okay. You know, years ago, I took a course or two in modern Jewish history. And over the years, because I study and teach, so I've read stuff about modern Jewish history. You know, I've heard things, I've seen things, I've been interested in things here and there. Okay, but I am by no means an expert on modern Jewish history. And when we talked about this last year, when people said, well, let's take it from the ages to today, okay, I told you, I said, heck, I'm not an expert on this. Now, I think the first semester, despite this lack of expertise, was more or less okay. You know, somebody who like really lives the field, what? I'm glad you liked it. I think somebody who really, lives the field could probably have done some things like, wow, okay. But overall, okay, it went out okay. And there may be a reason for that. Maybe the reason was because we were talking about the 1600s and the 1700s and the 1800s. And, none of you really live in the 16, 17, 1800s. And so you have these exotic names like I don't know, the Vilna Gaon and Moshe Mendelssohn, and it still sounds like it was a long time ago, right? Even though it was modernity, and even though it was already the big first clash with modernity, which not clash, I should say, but the first big challenge of modernity. How do you deal with the collapse of the Kehillah? And how do you deal with the opportunities and the dangers of the liberal, how should I say it? The liberal nations, okay, that are being established in Central Europe and in Western Europe, okay? That all of that stuff is modern, but it still sounds like a long time ago, okay? So, we studied some stuff about that. And I hope it was reasonably okay, but there's a lot that I'm not familiar with. And Joseph brought up an example of that last week. And this is what I want you to do especially next semester, because next semester, this problem is not going to be a little thing here and there. This problem is going to be gigantic. Do I know more about the 20th century than any of you? I tend to doubt it. Okay, and so this is going to become a really, really big thing. Okay, and if talking about people like, I don't know, Solomon Maimon, okay, so maybe I was kind of, leading this thing. When it comes to the 20th century, I'm going to expect you to fill in things, right? Lots of things that I don't know. With Heinrich Gretz, it came up a little bit. I knew Heinrich Gretz from his history books, okay? And that's when I thought, okay, when I pick two examples of Jüdische Wissenschaft, I'll pick Gretz because he has these great history books that have been translated into every possible language, and they're very impressive. And like, he was the first guy to really do it seriously. Okay, there were maybe a little bit before him, but he was the first guy to really do it seriously. So I presented him to you as an historian, but I didn't look up his biography. Just the very basics. I gave you his dates, where he lived, okay? And Joseph found some really interesting stuff in his biography, okay? So in his biography, first of all, do you know that this guy was, he was sponsored by Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch. He wanted to get residence in a city, and you needed to have, I guess, an address or a place of work or something. And he lived in Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch's house. Okay, Hirsch sponsored him so that he could live in Germany. Okay, he was a warrior against reform. Okay, originally, so the Jewish academic scholars, they were reform scholars, and it was Gretz mostly to change that. Okay, he turned academic Jewish scholarship, instead of being like a reform-run enterprise, to be more of a conservative enterprise. And besides writing history, he wrote all kinds of, arguments and polemics against the reform movement in Germany. But what eventually happened is that because he was so interested in history, and he got a doctorate and he's doing academic history, he didn't see completely eye to eye with Hirsch anymore. With his Rebbe, okay? With his sponsor, his Rebbe, whatever you want to call him. And Hirsch always had a what's the word? A nogdanim in English. He always had antiviruses. What do you call it? Antibodies. He always had antibodies to history. Hirsch didn't like history. Okay, it's not that he didn't know history. He knew history. He was a very smart guy. Okay, and he's a very well-read man. But he found history to be disturbing. Not history itself, like this happened in this year, but what we talked about maybe 2 weeks ago, historicism. Remember that one of the big features of modernity we talked about is historicism, which means that everything becomes historicized, including the Jewish tradition itself. Okay, and once it becomes historicized, and you say, well, Jews practiced this because that was their circumstances back then, and now the circumstances have changed, so what do we need it for anymore, right? This is exactly what the Reform movement did, because the Reform movement was highly influenced by this historicist kind of thinking. And now Gretz, the student and friend of Hirsch, is becoming an historian, and through his study of history, he's not always seeing exactly eye to eye with Hirsch anymore. Okay, so eventually he ganged up with a fellow, okay, that I'm sure at least some of you maybe have heard of, who was Zechariah Frankel. Have you heard of him? Zechariah Frankel was another one of these Wissenschaft guys, okay? Another one of these German Jewish academics of Jewish history and Jewish literature and stuff like that. He was also traditional, like Gretz, okay? Wasn't a reformist. And he was kind of, you know what you could describe it as? You can describe it, instead of calling it traditionalism, like with all the, nothing changes business, you could describe it as a moderate traditionalist. Moderate tradition, a moderate traditional Jew. Okay? There were
traditionalists.
well, that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
You had traditional Jews who were not traditionalists. You had the traditionalists who were like banging their fists, nothing can change, and this one's an apikorus, a heretic, and this one's no good, and we have to, divorce ourselves from reform, and all of that kind of stuff. But besides that, you just had, regular, if you can call it that, regular traditional Jews who they still kept the tradition, but they weren't like all, haywire with ideology. They could talk to a Reformed Jew or even to Avram Geiger, okay? And they weren't, trying to figure out who's a heretic and who's not a heretic. And they probably felt, the whole Jewish community should stay together. Okay, and not all of them were great scholars, but some of them were. For instance, Zechariah Frankel, okay, and his later on friend, who we're talking about, Heinrich Gretz. So this is very important for this course being held in Kilat Hakerem, because Zechariah Frankel, according to many historians,
The founder of conservative.
thought of as the founder or a founder, or at least an inspiration for what eventually became the conservative movement. Okay, he's traditional, but not traditionalist. Okay, he's historical, and yet he's not reformed. Okay, and Heinrich Gretz, the historian, he found a kindred soul in Zechariah Frankel. They found it.
In other words, he was sane.
In other words, he was sane. Okay. I guess sanity is always from your standpoint. Okay, but these were educated, nice people who loved the tradition and were also very aware of what's going on in the modern world and dealing with it and even living in it and living it. And okay, if that's sane, then that's sane. So Zechariah Frankel, I think there's even some American Jewish institution called after him. I can't remember what it is. Whatever, doesn't matter. And so he's often thought as like a proto-conservative movement Jew, Zechariah Frankel, and Gretz is also along those lines. Now, what Joseph brought up is not the conservative business, but the Christian business. Okay, there was a Christian event in the life of Heinrich Gretz. Believe it or not, even in modern 19th century Germany and Prussia, I guess it wasn't all in one country, and he was living in Germany. I don't know the details. I told you I'm not an expert, right? But
1876.
what?
In 1876, Bismarck had unified all the German states.
Okay, fine. So what do we have here? Thank you. So what do we have here? We have a lawsuit against Heinrich Gretz for insulting the Christian religion. Okay, that's the thing that Joseph brought up in the last class. I am no expert on this lawsuit, okay, but I can tell you with some I don't know, not authority, but some I don't know, reading experience, okay, that that this was symptomatic of a much bigger problem. Okay, Heinrich Gretz, his Jewish history was 11 gigantic, heavy volumes with lots of footnotes. The 11th volume was up until his day. He ended it in 1848. That's the end of history for Heinrich Gretz. How come? Because he didn't want to deal with any living person. Like maybe you'd insult somebody if you wrote about them and they're still alive in a history book. So he said, if I write the history up till 1848, then I'm only going to deal with major figures who have already died. Okay, so that's the 11th volume. And in the 11th volume, he deals with modern Germany and with modern Christianity and also with modern Christian scholars and modern Christian scholarships. And especially, you always have to keep this in mind, all this Wissenschaft stuff, like why put all this energy into Jewish history and whatever? Why? Why create a whole new academic field? How come? Because you want to show the Christians of Germany that this is a rich culture. This is a people that deserves respect, okay? This is a people that deserves the emancipation it was granted. And there was a lot of feeling among these Jewish academics that Christianity is very hyped, okay? And that some of our stuff, no, is even better, okay? And we have nothing to hide and we have nothing to be ashamed of. And since this is modern liberal Germany, basically, we can say this too, okay? And this is what inspires the lawsuit.
On what basis? On libel or on slander?
The slander of Christianity. Don't ask me. I don't know how in Germany or you get sued in the 19th century for slandering Christianity. Okay, but this was the lawsuit.
Normally,
Yeah.
you sue someone for something if it's a personal thing.
Uh-huh.
It's just slandering the whole religion. I don't know who's.
You want to know what it was about, Don?
Okay.
It was about the book of Isaiah, chapters 52 and chapter 53.
Yeah.
What's in those chapters? Who remembers?
Christians see a prophecy for the coming of Christ in those chapters.
It's the chapter of the suffering servant. The suffering servant of God. Okay? Isaiah describes the servant of God who suffers, and it seems to be a metaphor. The question, of course, is what is it a metaphor for? So, in Christianity, what is the explanation of the metaphor?
Suffering Christ.
It's obviously the passion of Christ on the cross. And in the, this has been debated for 2,000 years by Jewish and Christian readers of the Bible. And what was the Jewish position?
Jewish people.
It's the Jewish people, okay? Or at best, it's the Messiah who has not yet arrived, who will suffer, okay? And then traditional Jewish exegesis, you have both of these explanations. Either he's talking about the people, or he's talking about what will eventually happen to the Messiah. And it was what Gretz had to say about those chapters in Isaiah. Apparently, he kind of like put down the Christian interpretation, like this isn't serious, or something like that. And that's what the lawsuit was about. Now, another thing to keep in mind is this. Today, okay, we have lots and lots of Christians who are deeply interested in the Jewish origins of Christianity. It's very easy to find, okay? And there's no need to bring examples. This has been going on since the Holocaust, okay? This kind of dialogue between Jews and Christians, and the Christians saying, wow, okay, and we can understand ourselves so much better if we understand you, okay? Believe it or not, there's some Jews who said it in the other direction, far fewer, but some very serious Jews have said it in the other direction. Michael Visegrod is a primary example of that. He's a scholar of philosophy and a student of Rabbi Soloveitchik, who worked in most of his career was in interfaith Jewish Christian stuff, and he created he wrote a whole book on Jewish philosophy, which he says he couldn't have written had he not encountered Christianity. In other words, encountering Christianity helped him understand being Jewish better. Okay, specifically, he says, encountering Christianity freed him from Maimonides. Okay, but so anyways, you have this ever since World War II. Because this is so, apparent to us, it's hard for us to understand what there was before World War II. Okay, this did not exist or hardly existed before World War II. Christians were not interested in the Jewish tradition. If they were interested in the Hebrew Bible or in Jews, it was mostly with an eye to convert them. Okay, us, I mean, right? And usually it was not just that they were not interested. It was not just that they were neutral. There was antipathy. Okay, the New Testament is something spiritual and something very highly progressive, as opposed to the unspiritual, sullied, and primitive Old Testament. And what do the Jews represent? They represent the Old Testament. And this I did tell you last week, that the Jews represent the Old Testament in the Christian mind. And when the Old Testament is over, the Jews have the Jews contribute nothing more. They create nothing more. Okay? They're stuck with their Old Testament. We don't understand why they want this primitive Old Testament. And when the Old Testament story ends, Jewish creativity ends. They're just exiled among us and, bothersome and that kind of thing. All right? And there's no creativity. And what these Midreshet scholars went out to do is to show the richness of Jewish life and Jewish creativity and Jewish culture after the Old Testament. That was why it was important to write a Jewish history. That was why it was important to talk about sermons being midrashim, okay? So that the Christian world would the Jewish world also, right? Would be aware of the riches that it has. So that's what it was like then. This is most reflected in biblical scholarship. Okay, not just Wissenschaft des Judentums was created in the 19th century. Also, pretty much, academic study of the Bible was invented and begun in Germany in the 19th century. You can say Spinoza, another example here and there, okay? But as an academic discipline within the university, this is where it starts, okay? Academic study of the Bible. And, the classic documentary hypothesis, okay, as it was put together by Wellhausen, is meant to illustrate this. It divides the Old Testament into different sources, says which ones are earlier and which ones are later. The richer sources, the more lively sources are earlier, and the driest, most meaningless sources are last. In other words, ancient Israel degenerated. It went from J and E, okay, and then you have at the end priestly code. Okay, what is the priestly code? It's all this ritual, this dead, meaningless ritual of sacrifices that Jesus wanted to replace. Okay, this is a Hegelian, that's also German, right? This is a Hegelian history. That history, the culture creates, and then it degenerates. Then it creates, then it degenerates. So Jewish culture degenerated into meaningless, primitive ritual, superstition, and nonsense. And who came to save the day?
They say,
Jesus. Okay, and then Jesus brings a new spirituality that we find in the New Testament. If you ever wonder what makes scholars think of, to divide the Torah into historical sources, well, Spinoza had his own reasons. Okay, and Spinoza didn't exactly do that either. But Wellhausen had deeply Christian reasons. And most of the people involved in this kind of scholarship were Christian scholars. And Jewish scholars in the 19th century, early 20th century, they found biblical scholarship often to be a highly distasteful topic and a highly distasteful environment in the in the department, in the university. And none other than Solomon Schechter. What did he say about it? Who remembers? This you got to know. Solomon Schechter is famous for calling the higher criticism of the Bible of Wellhausen. He called it the higher anti-Semitism. Okay, now that I think is the background behind what was going on with Gretz and with this lawsuit. Okay, and it's also what's going on behind, like, why is so much energy being put into creating this new academic discipline of the science of Judaism? This is what is fomenting it. This is what's causing it. Okay. Well, we have to get on to tonight's topic sometime. All right, so let's get on to tonight's topic, if I can find my thingy of how we got here. Hold on. An error occurred. Reboot required, but we're not going to do that now. Okay, here we are. First of all, I added here Gretz, Wissenschaft, and German Christians. We just did that. And now, what are we going to do tonight? We're going to do Hebrew Haskalah in Germany and the Slavic East. And then we're going to go to the Muslim world. Okay. So first of all, we'll start in Germany, where Hebrew Haskalah was a failure. It didn't work. Or in other words, it died. Mendelssohn already in the 1700s tried to create a journal for Jews in the Hebrew language. Think about that. A popular journal the Jews would buy. There'd be discussions on it, about contemporary topics. And it would be in what language? Hebrew. Why Hebrew?
Because only Jews bothered to learn.
Only Jews bothered to learn Hebrew, except for the Christians who wanted to study the Hebrew Old Testament. All right. Well, let's think about it. Right? We already studied Mendelssohn a little bit. And we saw that when Mendelssohn published the Torah in 5 volumes for synagogue use, he published it with a translation into German and Hebrew letters on the side. For what purpose?
It's German.
For Jews to be able to learn German. He wanted to encourage Jews to learn modern German instead of this Yiddish. Okay, instead of this, Jewish genre. So why all of a sudden is he issuing a periodical in Hebrew?
Jews to learn Hebrew.
To encourage Jews to learn Hebrew?
Yeah.
What does Mendelssohn want? Well, remember that Mendelssohn was a very proud Jew and a very traditional Jew. And Mendelssohn wasn't just in favor of German. Mendelssohn was also in favor of Hebrew. And his proposal, I don't think it's an explicit proposal, but it comes out in the projects that he did, is that Jews in the modern emancipated world should have 2 languages. For inner Jewish stuff, what should be the language? Hebrew. And for living in the modern world, what should be the language? German. In other words, Jews in Germany should know both Hebrew and German. They should have intelligent discussions about Jewish topics in Hebrew, and deal intelligently and well with the modern world in German. If you're going to be a Jew in the modern world, you need to be bilingual. Hebrew and the language of culture and science, which is German. Okay, now that's not such an easy thing to do. Okay, first of all, in Europe, people and Jews in general, and Jews especially, often knew lots of languages. So that proposes so that perhaps there's merit to this. Okay, but not everybody knew more than one language, and not everybody knew specifically the languages that Mendelssohn wants them to know. And to live in the modern world fully in German, and to have your communal discussions in Hebrew, okay, it's not such an easy thing to achieve. So what happened? I want to show you it just so you can see it, Okay, this is the journal that Mendelssohn began. It was called Kohelet Musar. Kohelet like Ecclesiastes, okay? And it begins, this is the very first one, it begins with an essay about the beauties of nature, about how the Talmud says in the spring.
Avi, we can't see things.
You don't see?
No, it says reboot required
All
on
right.
your thing.
Let's try this again. Now do you see?
Oh, so strange.
Okay, here is Kohelet Musar, and it's an article about the beauty of nature and how the Talmud encourages you in the springtime when things are blooming to go out and make a special blessing. Okay, so this is Mendelssohn's idea of a journal, but unfortunately the journal fails. Okay, there was another attempt at the end of the 1700s called Hameasef. This wasn't specifically Mendelssohn. Okay, and here you have a poem in Hebrew. Get this, okay, in honor of Kaiser Joseph II. Okay. So you have these journals, but look how long these journals last. Kohelet Musar doesn't make it a year. Hameasef actually exists for a decade, and then it shuts down. But then in the 1800s, a journal is founded called, what is this? Shulamit. Okay, that's a nice, Jewish name for a journal. But look at it. Zeitschrift, it's in German. It's very, very Jewish. It even has some Hebrew writing on it. But the German Jewish journal will be published in German. In other words, the idea of Haskalah took off in Germany, but the idea of Hebrew Haskalah utterly failed in Germany, and it's easy to explain why. The answer is emancipation. If you're emancipated, you cannot have Jewish culture in Hebrew. It's a law of history, okay? And there's actually quite a few examples along the way, okay? If you're emancipated, Hebrew culture dies, period, okay? To give you some other examples of it later on in time, how many of you know, okay, especially the Americans with respect, okay, that there was a thriving a thriving Hebrew culture in the United States in the early and mid 20th centuries? There was a journal called Hadoar. Has anyone ever heard of it? All the Jewish intellectuals in the 20th century, they would write in Hebrew, in Hadoar, okay? Great stuff was written in Hadoar. And there were Hebrew language societies in the United States. And in fact, I recall this with, seems weird, okay? When I graduated Yeshiva University, I got a prize, okay? I got a prize from, I don't know what exactly it was called, the Hebrew Language Alliance, or something like that. And they sent us away for a weekend for two at the Homowac at a Jewish one of these Jewish places in the Catskills. The only time I ever went to a hotel in the Catskills. Okay, and so what was this? Apparently, it's Histadrut Ivrit America. That's what it was. The Hebrew Federation of America. And so apparently, the Hebrew Federation of America, they at one point donated money to Yeshiva University to sponsor a prize in each graduating class. Okay, for Hebrew language and literature, because Yeshiva University, by the way, is an example of this. Can you believe that in my time at Yeshiva University, there were college courses given in Hebrew? Did you know that? What? You did know that?
Surprised if it didn't.
You'd be surprised if it didn't. Well, when I went, it was like there's courses in Hebrew. Okay, I don't mean courses on Hebrew. I mean courses in Hebrew. Okay, courses like in Jewish studies that are taught in Hebrew. Courses on Hebrew language, obviously being taught in Hebrew. Okay, and I studied, for instance, modern Hebrew literature in Hebrew with an Israeli professor. Plus, they would also bring visiting Israeli professors who usually also taught in Hebrew, the college courses. And at the time, I was such an idiot. You know what I thought? I thought this is the wave of the future. I thought very quickly, right, that the Jews in America are going to understand that you cannot be an educated Jew unless you speak Hebrew. Right? And then I thought there are actually going to be more Hebrew courses at Yeshiva University. How many courses are taught at Yeshiva University today in Hebrew? Virtually zero. Maybe there is one that I don't that I don't know about. Okay, but this once existed. Okay, and this whole Hebrew culture in America completely, simply disappeared. Why did it disappear?
From my point of view, from my experience,
Yeah.
when I was very young, high school,
Yeah.
junior high age,
Yeah.
the conservative synagogue in Worcester, Massachusetts, had very high standards for
Mhm.
after-school education. We didn't
Okay.
do day school except for the yeshiva,
Okay.
the Chabad.
Yeah.
So people who cared a lot, spent a lot of
Yeah.
money and sent their kids to that school. If you were in Temple Emmanuel, where I was, the
Yeah.
Reform synagogue.
Yeah.
You had after-school education, but we never got out of present tense.
Mhm.
But the kids at the conservative synagogue were taking college board exams in Hebrew.
Oh yeah. There was the what do you call it? Not the SAT. No.
ACT,
What?
ACT.
ACT? Is that what it is?
This was, yeah.
Yeah. There's some kind of achievement exam
it
in
was
Hebrew
on
language. Right.
College boards. You could do it in
Nachon.
Hebrew.
Nachon.
But today, what I'm finding is all of these after
Yeah.
day school, public school kind
Yeah.
of Hebrew schools, they're all cutting back their hours.
Yeah. Of course.
The parents don't want to pay the same kind of money. The kids want to go and play soccer, football, basketball, baseball, whatever on Saturday. So the
Yeah, you're
idea of being
talking-
required to show up for Shabbat services and to participate.
What you're
in all-
talking about is the downfall of the Hebrew school, Sunday school kind of stuff, which in some places really did have a very high standards.
Yeah.
Another place where this existed, by the way, was in Camp Ramah, or also in Camp Moshava, right? Kids went to Camp Ramah and they came back, speaking some Hebrew. Is it like that today? I have no idea. I hope it is, but I don't know. Okay,
When they
and
came home,
what?
I used to teach there,
Yeah,
and so did Shosh. When kids got home, camp got 100 phone calls.
yeah,
Did you teach my kid to light Shabbat candles?
yeah.
Now they
You're
want to.
talking about Shabbat candles. We're talking about Hebrew language. Stuff in Ramah was done in Hebrew. Ken Moshavav B'nai Akiva, the same thing. Stuff was done, maybe still, I don't know, in Hebrew.
Yeah.
Young Judea, hey, okay,
Yeah,
hey.
yeah, my daughter started there at 7
Uh-huh,
and went to camp and
Yeah,
during
yeah.
the year also. By the way, my teacher was an afternoon Hebrew school teacher. for
Okay.
27 years.
all right.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Uh-huh.
So,
Yeah.
but there, everything was labeled in Hebrew.
Everything was labeled in Hebrew.
Yeah.
You had really serious Jewish culture in the United States, not just educational stuff for kids, but for intellectuals, for adults. You had a vibrant literary culture going on. There's a very, yeah,
You're making a parallel, or you're making an inference
yeah.
between Haskalah and the.
No, I'm not making an inference. I'm stating a rule.
Okay.
The rule is
All right.
that Hebrew culture cannot flourish where Jews are emancipated.
Okay, so.
Yeah.
The corollary to that
Yeah,
is that places where there isn't Haskalah, where there isn't emancipation.
where Jews are not
they have-
emancipated.
There is Hebrew culture. The question is,
Yeah,
was that true? Was that true?
Was
in
that
Israel? Was that
very
true
nice.
Was that
Don
true
is
in
asking, yeah,
in the Arab diaspora in
Okay.
Tunisia? I think.
Don is asking, was the opposite true? Okay, before I show you that the opposite was true, okay, just one more example, a very sad example. There's a figure in the early 1900s, okay, right after the communist revolution, a real maskil, okay, a person who was involved in Hebrew literature and in Hebrew education, teaching Hebrew in Hebrew, running an entire school in Hebrew in Russia. After the revolution was no longer allowed. So he was able to smuggle out letters still after the revolution. You know what he writes in one of his letters to a colleague in America? He says, here we have no hope. But in America, he says, I see the level of Hebrew culture, not Yiddish, of Hebrew culture in the United States. And I think that the level of Hebrew culture in the United States may be the highest anywhere. This is what he writes in the 1920s. And that it's the United States, he says, that gives me hope for the future of Hebrew culture. But it wasn't to be, okay? Let's look now at the,
But there was also, Avi,
yeah.
there were Hebrew-speaking academies
Mhm.
in Eastern Europe
Yeah,
in the beginning, in the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, and
Mhm.
many of the people that came then, the Aliyah Rishonah,
Mhm.
the first Aliyah, and then the second, they were perfect Hebrew speakers because they studied Hebrew there.
In the 20th, in the late 1800s, early 20th century, that is going to happen. There's going to be a massive educational movement that Chana is beginning to describe. What we're doing tonight are the precursors who allow what Chana is describing to eventually happen. In other words, somebody had to start it. And now we're going to see the people who started it. Okay? First, we'll mention a fellow by the name of Shlomo Levinson. Okay, these are his dates. He wrote a book called Militzat Yeshurun. Well, what is Militza? And what is Yeshurun? Let's do the easy one first. What is Yeshurun? Adat Yeshurun. Yeah. Ever go to a synagogue called Adas Yeshurun? Jeshurun. Okay? Yeshurun.
What it means.
Jeshurun is a biblical synonym for Israel. The people of Israel. That's why I have lots of synagogues that are called B'nai Yeshurun, Adat Yeshurun, whatever. What is Militzat Yeshurun? What is Militzat?
Song or interpretation.
It's a high language, like
Is
beautiful
eloquence.
eloquence.
The eloquence of Israel. What is this book? Which basically, the title basically means the eloquence of Israel. It's the earliest modern study of Hebrew poetics. Poetics doesn't mean poetry. Poetics means the study of how to use language in an eloquent way. But not German, rather Hebrew. How to use Hebrew in an eloquent way. And this study of poetics contains the first ever Hebrew translations of Shakespeare. Okay, and this is happening in the early 1800s. Okay, you have this fellow named Yosef Perel. Okay, he writes the first modern Hebrew satire. Now, if you're writing satire, you need somebody to make fun of. And who was there to make fun of in Poland in the early 1800s? No, it's right in front of you.
The Hasidim.
Okay, he writes a book making fun of the Hasidim, but it's not a rabbinic book, and it's not in Yiddish. He makes fun of them in Hebrew.
Hebrew.
Okay, that is revolutionary. Okay, we all
Hasidim,
what
because the Hasidim would never read it.
the Hasidim will never read it. You're saying.
It's in Hebrew.
The Hasidim did read it for sure, but okay. Now we actually saw somebody already. Let's see who remembers. We actually saw somebody who in his own way was rather humorous and had a lot to say to make fun of the Hasidim. Who was that? Solomon?
Schechter.
No, not Shechter. Remember
Solomon, yeah.
in his encounters with the Hasidim? And he's really like impressed with the Hasidim, but then he sees some things that make him say, I'm not staying here. Remember that?
Yeah.
Okay. So he did it. But what language did he do it in?
Yiddish, probably.
No, he spoke Yiddish, but he didn't write it in Yiddish. He wrote it in the language of culture, which was German. And who did he write it for? For Goyim.
We're going?
He didn't care about being Jewish.
Oh.
So he's describing to the Goyim the weird thing with this weird group of Jews called the Hasidim. Remember, the first English translation of that autobiography was also by a non-Jew. It didn't interest Jews until the 20th century. This autobiography of Solomon Maimon that we saw.
Can I just ask you,
Yeah,
we're talking here speaking Hebrew, speaking German, also Yiddish.
Mendelssohn, Solomon Mendelssohn.
You mentioned Yiddish as well.
we're not up to Yiddish yet. Hold your horses with Yiddish. What we have here is a movement to have Jewish culture in
Hebrew.
So
Hebrew.
the average German Jew at this time will speak what?
In the 1800s, German. That's why it fails in Germany.
Because they don't want to speak Hebrew or they don't know Hebrew.
They don't want to speak Hebrew, they don't know Hebrew, and they don't care about Hebrew. Therefore, Jewish discussion is going to be in German. I mean, this goes along. The Reform movement, for instance, decided to change the vast majority of the liturgy in the synagogue into German. Prayers are in German, not in Hebrew, except for maybe, a couple little things. Okay, and we even saw it with the Orthodox. We saw last week, I believe. Okay, we saw a debate between the Würzburger Rav and Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch in what language?
In German.
In Hochdeutsch. Okay, they're reading
Hochdeutsch.
each other in High German, and they're quoting the Gemara in Hebrew in the middle of all the German. And somebody last week asked, why didn't they write it in Hebrew? Now you have the answer. If you are emancipated, and even Hirsch, with all his orthodoxy, he's emancipated. If you are emancipated, Hebrew culture dies. Yes.
Just as kind of a sidestep,
Yeah.
years ago, we were in Paris for 10 days.
Okay.
Avi, we cannot hear.
Someone's talking in Kilat Hakerem, I'll repeat it.
Okay, so, what we found is if we went into kosher restaurants, people didn't interact with us in English, they interacted in Hebrew.
Yes, of course.
And they were, very receptive. And I'm wondering if France progressed in the same way,
You're asking
nation-
about France. Okay, the question here is about France and about even France nowadays. Okay, nowadays it's because of the Israelis. Anywhere you go in Hebrew, in Moldova, the only language to speak with Jews is Hebrew. Okay, not just France. But we're talking about the
It's
the
not a
1900s.
cross-cultural
The
level.
1900s, something else happens in France that we will get to.
Oh,
Okay, so we're gonna get to Yiddish and we're gonna get to
right.
France. Okay, now Yiddish is lurking in the background here because all of these people speak Yiddish. Okay, but they want Hebrew culture to be in here. I said Hebrew culture. They want Jewish culture, excuse me, to be in Hebrew. Let's look at Avraham Mapu, who wrote a book called The Love of Zion in 1853. What is the love of Zion? In Hebrew, it's Ahavat Zion. What a beautiful name for a book. This is the first modern Hebrew novel ever. So let's take a look.
In English, of course.
Not in English. You're going to look at the real thing. Okay? The actual real thing. But Zoom always makes things more difficult than they need to be.
Yes.
Hold on. Okay, this is this is a reprint. It's the second edition. This is printed in 1873. You see, Ahavat Zion, the love of Zion, Me'iti, by me, Avraham ben Yekutiel Mapu, Ish Kovna. He was from Kovna, Lithuania. And it begins here, with a biblical phrase, Tocho Ratzuf Ahava, Mi Benot Yerushalayim. His innards, his inside is filled or covered with the love of the daughters of Jerusalem. Printed in Warsaw by the brother Matityahu Mapo. After he died, his brother reprinted the book. And here is to the reader, and I'll put it on one page so you can see it really large. And we're just going to read one sentence. We're going to read right now the first sentence of modern Hebrew literature. Okay? Try to get a sense for the Hebrew, those of you who know some Hebrew. Ish haya b'Yerushalayim. There was a man in Jerusalem. Bimei Achaz Melech Yehuda. In the days of Achaz.
King Ahaz.
Ushmo Yoram Ezer.
Ben Aviezer.
It was Yoram ben Aviezer. Aluf b'Yehuda v'Sar Elef. He was a prominent man in Judah and the captain of 1,000, meaning he commanded 1,000 troops. Vayhi lo sadot uchramim b'Karmiel v'Sharon. He had pastures and vineyards in the Carmel mountain range and in the Sharon, where Ranana and Netanya are. Ve'edrei tzonu v'kar, and he had lots and lots of flocks, cattle. Bethlehem, in Bethlehem of Judah. In other words, he has wealth all around the country. He had gold and silver. He had what's the word? Not temples, but like halls. The halls, thank you. Halls of ivory. Halls of ivory, the whole schiyot, all manner of luxurious things. Ushte nashim ayulo. This is all one sentence. Ushte nashim ayulo. He had two wives. Shema achat Chagit bat Ira, the first wife's name. V'shema shenit Naama. The second wife's name is Naama, which means pleasant. Vayehav Yoram et Naama me'od. He loved Naama very much. ki yifat tori, for she was very beautiful. Vatikane b'chagit sarata v'tachisena. So the other co-wife would get very angry. Ki lechadgit hayu shnei banim ulenaama lo haya valad. Okay, because she didn't have a child, and that would hurt a lot. It's built on the story of Hannah and Penina here in the first sentence.
Yeah, it's very much a Tanakh kind of language.
Hannah, he uses biblical Hebrew. He's telling a story in biblical Hebrew, and not just the stories being told in biblical Hebrew. It's
a biblical story.
Historical fiction,
Yeah.
right? It's like, you tell a story about someone who lived during the American Revolution, who didn't really live, but you describe it as if he's living during the time of the American Revolution. We call that historical fiction. And that's exactly what this is. He makes up characters, a family, and there's going to be a son to this son, Naama, and he's going to fall in love with somebody, okay? And it's going to be a love romance, this story here, being told in biblical Hebrew, but for a modern novel, okay?
Like Rachel and Leah,
Oh, I'm sorry?
like Rachel and Leah, Biduk.
Yeah, okay, very nice.
Or like Hannah, the story of Hannah and her husband's
Yes.
other wife.
So he writes this novel, okay? It's the beginning of the modern Hebrew novel. And eventually it becomes, not only are there lots of streets in Israel named after Avraham Mapu, there's also, it was made into a play right after the establishment of Israel, Ahavat Zion, in Tel Aviv.
You said it was only published after his death by his brother.
No. It was published in 1853 by him. It was republished. We saw the republication, the second edition. Okay, I couldn't find the scan of the first edition.
So it was popular then, people didn't want to buy it.
It was popular. He was writing this for the youth, right? In other words, think of it, all these intellectuals, they try to found these journals for, intellectual adults to have their discussions. What does Avraham Mapu think? I want the young people to read in Hebrew, right? That's exactly what he did. You have later figures like Yehuda Leib Gordon, Yalag, and then you have, and this is for Gordon, Mendel Moicher Sforim, okay, who wrote modern Hebrew literature. But as time went on, he veered away from the Hebrew and went for Yiddish literature. And he's mostly known, Davka, for his Yiddish literature. Okay, and he's also showing us a certain kind of attention that exists. If you have a Jewish language like Yiddish that you speak, and everybody around you speaks it, then why should you try to create literature in another language? Shouldn't you write your literature in your mother tongue, which is Yiddish? And that's what happened to Mendel and Moicher Sforim. Now, both of these figures, Yehuda Leib Gordon and Mendel and Moicher Sforim, they're considered the end of the classic period of Hebrew Haskalah literature, because that period comes to an end when modern Zionism rises as a political movement, which begins in 1882. And so you can see that it's the end of the life of Yehuda Leib Gordon and, well into the life, towards the end of the life of Mendel and Moicher Sforim. And once the Zionist movement takes off as a political movement with an agenda and with real practical to create a Hebrew-speaking society, then Hebrew literature takes off even more powerfully.
That's something I still don't understand. Where does Yiddish come from then?
Okay.
How does it start?
Okay, well, you're asking not about this, you're asking about where did Yiddish come from? Yiddish is a Jewish genre of German, just like Jews had genres everywhere they lived. The two most famous examples are Judeo-Arabic, was the Jewish genre of Arabic. You have Judeo-Spanish, right? Ladino, the Jewish genre of Ladino. And what happens in every single one of these cases is that the Jews write the native language in Hebrew letters, okay? And they make a Jewish version of it with all kinds of, Hebrew and Aramaic words. And eventually, if the Jews are cut off enough, even the grammar begins to change and the intonations begin to change. And that happened big time with Yiddish, because the Jews emigrated from Germany to the east, right? To Poland, to what eventually became Ukraine, and then Russia, Hungary, okay? And when the Jews left Germany, when they left the German-speaking environment, what basically happened is the Germans split in two, right? German went on in Germany, but German also left Germany with the Jews. And so it became a completely other language with similarities, but it's not the same language anymore.
But Yiddish is for the ordinary person.
Yiddish
not
is,
to the educated.
again, Yiddish is for everyone. Okay, German Jews who, if their families who immigrated to the East, what they spoke became what we know as German. And yet the educated people, the rabbis, right? They would write in Hebrew. Okay, they would not write in Yiddish.
So most of the common person wouldn't understand it then.
The common person wouldn't understand a rabbinic commentary on the Talmud anyways.
Even if at least it was written in Yiddish, you could read it.
If it's written in Yiddish, you could read it, you say. And there were some things written in Yiddish for the common people. But there wasn't a popular literary culture. It didn't exist. We live in a world where we have billions and zillions of books just for entertainment, right? There was not so much literature for entertainment back then. And the little that there was usually a popular version of something from the Torah. Okay, a popular version of halacha, a popular version of midrash for the weekly parsha. All of that could be in Yiddish. Okay, but most of the people who spoke Yiddish and didn't understand, they might have understood the prayers in Hebrew a little bit, the Torah reading a little bit, but these people didn't read so much. Okay, and if they did read, then it would be to learn Mishnayos or to read Tehillim or something like that. It's only in modern times where you have this idea of literature for entertainment, of literature that is secular. Okay, that's what we've been looking at on this sheet here.
But these common people would be able to speak German.
What?
Would they speak German?
That's exactly the problem.
No.
That's exactly the problem. In the 1800s, the common people already speak German in Germany. Therefore, they have no use for
Hebrew.
And in the end, we find that even the educated rabbis, even fantastic scholars, they end up writing in German instead of Hebrew. It doesn't work in Germany because they're emancipated and because they live in a German-speaking world. Okay.
I still don't understand then where Yiddish comes from then, because there doesn't seem to be a need for it. Why do you have to change the language?
Look, you've got millions of Jews in Eastern Europe who speak Yiddish, okay?
But it starts off in Germany.
It starts off in Germany, just like Judeo-Spanish started off in Spain.
It starts off.
But
Cut
the
off
emancipation
communities.
starts off when people are living in separate communities.
When you're living in separate communities, exactly. German Jews are emancipated. They no longer live in special communities. And divided, what?
They've got no German. Why do you need Yiddish? They've got German.
That's the whole point.
You don't need it.
You don't need it.
So why did they start up then?
Why isn't there
It-
a special?
I don't know where, we have some kind of,
Version of.
okay.
Who starts up?
we're having some kind of lack of communication, okay?
Starts in German.
In the 1500s,
So way back to the 1500s.
yes.
Yeah,
I don't.
Yiddish is very old.
Yeah. So it was the dates that were confusing you?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, Yiddish is many, many centuries old. Okay, in Eastern Europe, it becomes completely divorced from German. Okay, and it becomes the common language of the Jews. Now, even in Germany, Jews kept speaking Yiddish until when? The 1900s, when they're emancipated. Once they're emancipated, they no longer have a use for Yiddish, and they speak German. But in Poland and in Hungary or wherever, they're still speaking Yiddish. Is it clear now?
Yeah.
Okay, so in Germany, it doesn't work. Mendelssohn tries to make Hebrew literature in Germany, and it doesn't work. Where does it work? It works in Poland. It works in Lithuania. It works in Hungary and in Russia. And in all of the places where the Jews are not emancipated, they decide to go ahead and create Hebrew literature and to try to have the inner Jewish discussions, okay, not just inner discussions, try to have all Jewish culture be expressed in Hebrew. No, not in Yiddish, in Hebrew, Davka in Hebrew, which is strange because it is not the language that they speak. They speak Yiddish. They want culture in Hebrew. How come? Well, Yiddish may have been thought of by many people as this kind of low-level Jewish genre, whereas all the riches of our culture are in what language? Hebrew. And the rabbis for all these centuries have been writing in Hebrew. And our poets for all these centuries have been writing in Hebrew, etc., etc. So now let's continue this into modern times and have modern secular Hebrew literature and culture. Okay, what does this achieve? You know, you could think, and it would be a good question to ask, okay, who the heck cares? Let's say you had a few dozen Jewish intellectuals in Eastern Europe who are writing literature in Hebrew. Is that really so important for history? Good question. Should have asked it. That's just kidding. No? Is it really that important?
It becomes important because Hebrew then has a place from which it can be renewed. It's maintained as a spoken language.
Exactly. Thank you. If it was not for the Zionist movement, this would have remained no more than a footnote in history, and all of these people would have been largely forgotten. But there eventually was a Zionist movement. And it was this literary movement which created the, what do you call it? Like when you have enough mass, the critical mass. This created the critical mass for the eventual flowering of the Hebrew language. Okay, these people did it. Okay.
Maybe it was the impetus, it was
Yeah.
the same Zionist impetus that created the desire to speak
Okay,
Hebrew.
so you're saying it was the same Zionist impetus, and I agree with you, okay? There was nothing political about it. Meaning, when he writes this novel in publishes this novel in 1853, okay? I think if I remember correctly, he actually went to visit, okay, to see the land that he's writing about and that kind of thing. You know, there's nostalgia for the land of Israel, but who is this man? You know, he's writing a novel. He's not gonna create a country. Okay, it's two different.
You have to wait for a journalist to do that.
I have to wait for a journalist to do that. Okay, you know, the feelings exist in the mid-1800s, but it's only a small scattering of people, okay, who are really into it. And you know, in Germany, you had Moshe Hess. Okay, who at the same time as Avram Mapu, he's writing a Zionist, a political Zionist track. Herzl eventually discovers the track that Moshe Hess wrote. It's, oh, I never knew about this, right? If I had known, I would have written my book. Okay, but nobody knew about it. Nobody cared about it. All the German Jews thought that Moshe Hess was literally insane. Okay, And, even somebody like Avram Mapu, it's inspiring for the young people who are reading the book, and people are saying this is so beautiful, right? But very few people are actually thinking, I'm going to leave Poland and go to Eretz Israel. Okay, it doesn't really happen yet. It's not yet a
The
movement.
stirrings may have.
The stirrings are
May
beginning.
have already begun.
Exactly.
Because of also nationalism
Yeah.
was also the rage in the 19th century.
No.
So Jews also maybe had the same impetus toward
Yeah.
nationalist feelings, and that's.
Yeah. Okay. What most of the Jews in this time thought is that we are a people. I'm talking about the Eastern European Jews. We are a people. We have a culture, but we're here. Since we're here, what are we going to eventually need to do? Eventually, it happens again a little later than this time, we'll need to know Polish and Hebrew. We'll need to know Hungarian and Hebrew, etc. Okay? But to say that's not going to work, and we better go to where we'll speak Hebrew, okay, that's not happening yet. And yet what I just described was what you're saying. That is a bit of a stirring, okay? The stirrings are happening now. Let's finish with Mendele Mocher Sfarim. Okay, I said it, but maybe now it'll be clearer what I said. Okay, Mendele Mocher Sfarim is the personality on this page who really gets moved by the problem of Yiddish. Who says, what are all these people doing? What am I doing? Writing in Hebrew. Where when in Poland, the Polish nationalists, what do they write in? No, in Polish, the language that they speak. So why am I writing in Hebrew? Maybe I really should be writing in Yiddish. And this is going to create something that will take off in the 20th century, the wars of the languages. That there was a gigantic war between Hebrew and Yiddish. Okay, it already happens a little bit in the 19th century. Most of these authors, okay, and I didn't bring you all the authors, a lot of other ones, but most of these authors have a distaste for Yiddish. In other words, they may speak it, they may even like it for day-to-day things, but they don't see it as a language of culture. And then there's going to come along some Jews who will say, hey, let's make it into a language of culture. And then is one of those.
Pre-state Israel, wasn't there, about which language they should be teaching?
Also in Israel, you're correct, both pre-state and also post-state.
Yeah.
Right? You have Ivri, Daber, Ivrit. Hebrew, speak Hebrew, right? Yeah.
My father-in-law also spoke about it being sent to a Talmud Torah or a Cheder by his parents, and they chose a Yiddish Cheder. So he learned his Jewish studies in Yiddish and not in Hebrew.
So your relative,
That was my father.
Your father.
Father-in-law.
Your father-in-law studied in a Yiddish Cheder. Okay. So let's yeah. Yes, Mary.
Like the ultra-Orthodox insist that Hebrew was a holy language and shouldn't be spoken in the vernacular.
That's a very good point. That already started in the 19th century. Okay. In other words, the Hungarian Orthodox rabbis, okay, let me go one step back. A lot of these people who are doing Haskalah in Hebrew, a lot of them are traditional. They live traditional lives. They had a lot of sympathy for tradition, right? But like the people we talked about earlier, they weren't like hard-headed, and so there was opposition to it. It was the Hungarian rabbis who issued as a halachic psak, get this, halachic psak, that a drasha in the synagogue must be in Yiddish. It can't, that's already in the 19th century. It cannot be in another language. Now, it's not like in Hungary that people were going to have drushas in Hebrew, but what were they going to do? They're going to have them in Hungarian. Okay, so this was basically saying that Jews loyal to the Torah must speak Yiddish rather than Hungarian. Okay, as opposed to the German, like Mendelssohn, right? German Jews will need both Hebrew and German, but what eventually happened, it became just German. Okay, and that's exactly what was being predicted. Okay, that it would fail. Okay, it cannot work. So all of these people live in lands that are not emancipated, and where you're not emancipated, Hebrew can flourish. Okay, it's also a matter, like we said at the beginning, of numbers, right? There's so many Jews here that you can have a thriving Yiddish culture and you can have a thriving Hebrew culture. But in Germany, you're a small minority. Okay? And you're emancipated to boot, speaking German all day long. So how in the world are you going to have a flourishing Hebrew culture? We'll stop with that, and we'll take a short break. You have until 51.
That is short.
Okay. Besides literature, one of the ideas of the Haskalah, the Hebrew Haskalah, that was very important was that Jews should get secular education. That doesn't mean that they should give up on traditional education. It means that they should have both, which to I think none of us is that a radical idea, but it was quite a radical idea in the 1900s. Okay.
Torah and Derech Eretz.
Hirsch gave it a whole ideological name, Torah and Derech Eretz. It's good that you remembered. But we're talking here not about Orthodox, or not about non-Orthodox either. We're talking about these Hebrew maskilim who are traditional, and they want Jewish children to know the tradition, but they also want Jewish children to learn about the world and to have secular knowledge and to be able to support themselves. And this meant that you need a whole new system of schools. Remember, the Torah in Derech Eretz of Hirsch is in Germany, where Hebrew Haskalah died. Okay, we're talking about the Eastern Europe, right? And the idea was that in Poland and in Russia, etc., that Jewish children should be having secular education along with their traditional education. Okay, that was a very, very big part of the Haskalah, and that was something that Hirsch didn't oppose it, but who did oppose it? In Hungary, right? And in all of the places where you had the kind of traditionalism that we started out with, that nothing changes, right? And that anything new is forbidden by the Torah and you have to keep far away from it. Because if you change even one thing, if you start giving sermons in the synagogue in Hungarian, the next thing you know, you're going to be Reformed, and then the next thing you know, you're not going to be Jewish.
This is a slippery
So
slope.
slippery slope, exactly. Okay, that was the reaction among the traditionalists of Europe, even to the idea of getting a secular education alongside of a Torah education. Now, this was not true everywhere. In Europe, everything is ideological in the modern age. Why? Because modernity came to Europe, and modernity is highly ideological. Okay, and when I've said this at least 10,000 times, right? The Middle Ages were not ideological. Tradition is not ideological, and all of a sudden, modernity is hyper ideological. Okay. Everything in modernity is ideological, okay? And modernity is shaped by all of these conflicting ideologies that replace each other or exterminate each other.
It's not recording.
It's not recording, but I pressed it. So I pressed the Zoom recording.
No, yeah, it wasn't recording. Go ahead.
Okay. So in Europe, you have the traditionalist Orthodox have a very negative reaction to the idea of secular education for Jewish children, which is also a central idea of the Haskalah. What about, yeah,
That's the attitude of the modern Haredim here.
you say
Exactly.
the modern Haredim. The modern Haredim here are the spiritual and biological even descendants of the people we're talking about. Okay, so what about the rest of the Jewish world? Where else were there Jews?
The US.
There were some in the US in the 1900s. It wasn't a big deal, but there were some nice communities.
Western Europe.
Western Europe, there were some nice communities in Western Europe. Hold on a second. Hold on a second. First, Brian. Yes, in Western Europe, the Jews are also emancipated, right? In France, you mentioned, we'll get to, and in Britain, certainly. Okay.
Until the 1880s, there weren't many.
There weren't many until the 1880s in Britain, that's true. But you know, all of these are dealing with European modernity. What about outside Europe?
North
Which?
Africa.
North
Middle East.
Africa,
And the Arab countries, Iraq, Iran.
Iran, Persia. Okay, you have a whole world that is outside of Europe or outside of European Enlightenment influence. Okay. And what is going on there? And here we're going to get a contrast. Here you're going to see what is the difference between tradition, which is not ideological, and traditionalism and anti-traditionalism in Europe, which are both highly ideological. So I'll share the screen with you yet again. And here we are. Has anyone ever heard of the Lemel School in Jerusalem? Anybody? No, it won't let me do slideshow. Do people on Zoom see the text?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay.
Yeah. See it, yes.
For some reason, it's not letting me enlarge it. I don't know why. Oh, come on.
Its size is fine.
Okay, if the size is fine, I'll just leave it. Okay, what is the Lemel School in Jerusalem? Well, in 1856, there was a nice man, if I remember correctly, from Prussia, who wanted to donate money to build a school for children in Jerusalem. And it would be a school where they would learn Torah and where they would also learn secular studies. And he thought that this would improve the lot of the Jews of Jerusalem who suffered dearly. The poverty was immense. So he set up this school. You can see a picture of it here. I'll show you first this picture. Okay, hold on a second. It'll be big. No. Oh, no.
Ay, ay, ay.
Ay, ay, ay.
All right, just a second.
Right.
Just a second. Ah, that didn't take too long. That wasn't so bad. Wasn't as painful as I thought it might be. Okay, here you can see this is the entrance to the level. Look what it says.
We
You
don't see.
have to reshare, Avi, you have to reshare it.
Share again.
Reset the share. Sorry. Okay. This is the entrance to the building. It's not the original building. It's a building that the school moved to later when it was bigger. Beit Sefer Laha'atzil Levet Lemel. In other words, a school dedicated to the memory of the Lemel family. Okay. Edler von Lamel Shul. Okay, the school of Edler von Lamel. So you can see some of the building here. Okay, the clock on top. If I make it smaller, you can even get a little bit of a better view. Now, what is this school, the Lemel School? 1856, this well-meaning man wants to create a school in Yerushalayim so that people can learn to trade and support themselves and to maybe alleviate the terrible poverty in Yerushalayim. He's a very wealthy man. He's donating all this money, and he doesn't go in person. He sends someone who works for him to be responsible for setting up the school for him in Yerushalayim, or maybe it was someone who lived in Yerushalayim. The guy who's in charge, right, of setting up this school, finds himself deterred with all-out war. What war? Who's attacking him? What you nowadays call the Haredim, but they didn't call them the Haredim back then. Right? It's what we nowadays call the Yishuv Hayashan. Okay, the rabbis of Jerusalem, but which rabbis? Here's the good part. In Yerushalayim, you basically had two kinds of rabbis at the time. Some of them were called Ashkenazic, and some of them were not called Ashkenazic. Okay, and it was the Ashkenazic rabbis who gave this man hell, literal hell, for trying to set up a school in Yerushalayim that would teach children a trade. Why did they give him hell? Because these rabbis, these Ashkenazic rabbis, came from Europe. And they saw Yerushalayim in the 1900s as a place of refuge from the spirit of the emancipation and the enlightenment, the Haskalah. And all of a sudden, this evil man is going to bring the evil Haskalah right into the walls of the holy city of Yerushalayim, which until now had protected us from the Haskalah.
No, we just kill them off with poverty, disease, and starvation, That's better than knowing me.
All right, so some sarcastic comments in Kilat Hakerem. They saw this as a threat to their refuge. At least in the holy city of Jerusalem, there needs to be refuge from these awful modern trends. And at least in Yerushalayim, the education of young children has to be as it always has been, and nothing will change. And now they're going to build this school, no? And it will change. So the fellow who was working for Lamel, what did he do? He found a very easy solution to the problem.
Hired them.
He went to the Sephardic rabbis. Okay? He went to the Sephardic rabbis. The Sephardic rabbis had no problem with this. They couldn't even understand why all this ferociousness, why all this argumentation. The man wants to build a school. Isn't that nice? Isn't that, what's the issue here? They couldn't begin to understand. What eventually happened to this school? I'll show you. If I can.
You say that because the Sephardic rabbis didn't know what emancipation was.
The Sephardic rabbis were not ignoramuses. Okay, they could hear from their Ashkenazic neighbors what's going on in Europe, but their what's the word? Their
common sense.
Their common sense, their outlook, their spirit was completely different. It didn't make any sense to them as rabbis to have all of this vicious war against setting up a school, which Sachakol, what's the school going to do? It's going to teach Torah, and it's going to teach a trade to these children. So the Sephardic rabbis can say, okay, show me where does the Torah forbid something like this?
Or encourages having a day job.
Yeah, the Torah encourages having a day job, right? Like, what the heck is going on here? Okay? They're not ignoramuses. They do know what's going on in Europe. But not only do they not identify with reform or assimilationism or enlightenment, They also don't, what's the word? I just used the word. They also don't identify with this extreme traditionalist backlash. What does a traditional mind do? A traditional Jewish mind, at least, okay? A traditional Jewish mind says, what does the Ribono Shel Olam want us to do? What does God want us to do? Does God want us to educate our children? No. Yes.
Of course.
Okay. Does God tell us that any school which is in any way the least bit different than any previous school is forbidden?
No.
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 So if a Sephardic rabbi with a traditional mindset is trying to figure out what God wants, it's very easy to say that, okay, so we'll set up the school. Okay? It's not that hard to do. Now, all of the Zoom stuff is making my life very difficult. Hold on a second. How do I get it? Get it back by doing this, and then by doing this, and then I will show you another picture. Here is a wider picture of the school. Oh, come on. What did I do? Here it is. Okay. It says Eitz Chaim on top. Okay. Merkaz HaTorah HaGadol. Harishon Be'eretz Yisrael. What is that? The same clock. Remember the clock? It's still there. And now look. It says, it's covering up the plaque, which dedicates it to the Lamel family. And it says, Bruchim habayim mishkanenu hachadash. Welcome to our new home. Knisa Rashit with an arrow. Here's the main entrance to the building. What happened? That about, if I remember correctly, about 20 years ago, okay? About 20 years ago, even more than 20 years ago, the thing was sold. Okay, it became the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva. The Eitz Chaim Yeshiva is like the classic old Yeshuv school. Okay, where all the children went to learn Torah. And all the stories about the neighborhoods of Yerushalayim. Rabbi Levine, for instance. Was always has stories about children who learned in Eitz Chaim. And when it says Merkaz HaTorah HaGadol, Harishon Be'eretz Yisrael, it's not talking about the first school in Israel that teaches secular studies. It's talking about Eitz Chaim being the first Merkaz Gadol Torah in Eretz Yisrael. So the people who opposed the Lamel school eventually took over the building.
It's a credit for
They took over the building because.
The school closed. No,
Israel-
because the school closed.
Yeah, the school closed, but then.
This was already like in the late 1900s already.
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
okay, because Israeli society took over the education of children and gave them secular studies.
Or it also could be that the neighborhood that the school was in no longer had children who wanted an education like that. Okay, so that's what happens to the Lamel school. And to go back to our thingy here, okay, the Lamel school in Jerusalem, 1856, the Ashkenazic rabbis, oh, for goodness sake, the Ashkenazic rabbis wage a war against it. And so the Sephardic rabbis welcome it. Something is going on here. So Jenny asked about France, right? I'm not going to deal with France in general, but a very, very important organization was formed in France, in Paris in 1860. And it was called, I'm sure many of you have heard of it, Alliance Israelite Universelle. Ring a bell?
Sure.
Some of you? All of you? It still exists as an organization for sure. All right. In Hebrew, it was called Kol Yisrael Chaverim. which means all of Israel are brothers. It's a very national kind of statement, and it's abbreviated Kiach, Kof Yod Chet, Kol Yisrael Chaverim. And you have a street in Yerushalayim named after Kiach. And what did this organization?
What's the name again in English? Alliance?
In French, Alliance Israélite Universelle. It's written up
Oh,
there.
sorry.
Okay. The Universal Israelite Alliance. That helps. Now, what did this organization try to do? Ladies and gentlemen, do you know what it does?
Sets up schools.
Okay, it actually was meant for Jewish prosperity and Jewish defense. And they thought the Jewish communities around the world would be stronger and less prone to being attacked if they had good, solid education systems, and if they would be prepared for what do you call it? To have said it before. Okay, that if Jews had a trade, and if schools would train Jews to have a trade, also if Jews would have languages, right? If you speak languages that were useful in the world of business, commerce, whatever. Okay. So they set up schools all around the Jewish world, but especially in Muslim countries. In the Ottoman Empire, in places even beyond the Ottoman Empire, they set up schools. Alliance Israélite Universelle schools. One of the schools in the 1800s was set up in Baghdad. Okay. Well, what's going to happen when you set up a school in Baghdad? That it's not anti-traditional. It will teach Torah, let's say, and it will also teach children to learn a trade. What will be the reaction in Baghdad?
Reaction.
Okay, let's send our kids there. Sounds good. What will the rabbi say in the Chacham in Baghdad?
No problem. Great idea.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, there was a Chacham in Baghdad when the school was established. He's usually known as the Ben Ish Chai. Have you heard of him? Every city in Israel has a Beit Knesset Ben Ish Chai. There's one in Karmiel someplace too. Okay. The Ben Ish Chai was a highly revered Torah scholar all around the Jewish world. And you know what he did when the Alliance School was founded in Baghdad? He gave a Shabbos drasha. That's exactly how they say it in Baghdad, right? Actually, he gave a drasha on Shabbat about secular education. In his drasha on Shabbat, he gave a whole history, okay, of Jews who knew secular culture and worked in secular culture and contributed to secular culture. Okay, and all of the things in Chazal about how you have to teach your child the trade and how there is wisdom among the nations of the world and all of that. And basically, the rabbi got up at the pulpit, and this is no reform rabbi. This is not even a moderate traditional rabbi or something like that. This is a guy with a beard and peyot and somebody who's revered to this day by the Haredim. Okay, who got up in shul and said, "Send your kids." Okay, so what's going on in Europe is not going on in this other world.
Just
Yeah,
a question, in all these places,
yeah.
for Jewish kids, you had to go to Jewish school. You couldn't go to, there was no,
Jews and Muslims at that point didn't study together. No.
and but also in Europe as well, it didn't, I mean, even in Germany, this
Europe for
Jewish kids would go to secular
okay,
school.
Europe for the most part was the same, but in an emancipated place like Germany, I'm not sure it was completely the same.
But basically then your kids either went to like a yeshiva or to these new style schools.
No, Alliance didn't work so much in Europe.
No, I'm just saying, but
Yeah.
that's the option.
The option was either.
Also,
The option was either to go to a traditional school, the Cheder in Europe, or to go to a new kind of school.
Yeah.
Right? And the rabbis went nuts, right? That you have to go to a Cheder. You can't go to a new kind of school. Except for rabbis, like Brian correctly said, like Rav Shamshon Chaya Hirsch, who dedicated himself to this philosophy of Torahim Derech Eretz, but he was very careful that he set up a school that would be truly Orthodox in spirit and have high-level secular studies. Okay? In Baghdad, you can see, he's not even checking it out that carefully. He's not like, trying to identify, what is the ideology of Allianz. As long as the school is going to do a good job, it's all for it.
Was there any kind of a backlash from the broader non-Jewish community? Because
what?
you have Jews competing for professional jobs or for trades.
I'm not-
Weren't allowed to enter.
I'm not aware, but the fact that I'm not aware doesn't mean anything. Eventually, there were fierce persecutions in Baghdad included, but that was later. In the 1900s, was there any reaction by the non-Jews? I don't know. Okay. I imagine for the most part, the non-Jews couldn't care. If Jewish money is setting up a Jewish school, then what the heck? The Jews can do whatever they want.
Okay, so it's not the same kind of thing like in the States. You
Yeah.
actually have been sentenced to jail in some places for teaching Black people to read.
You're talking about enslaved states.
You're talking about post-Civil War.
Post-Civil
even,
War.
where-
Maybe. Okay, I don't think there's really going to be a similarity here. Okay, now this is something that runs shot through the culture. Okay, sometimes chronology doesn't fit with historical trends. Okay, and you can have something appearing at a later date, which reflects something that began at a much earlier date or continues from an earlier date. And I'm going to do this now because it fits the trend we're talking about tonight, even though some of the examples are much later. The Lemel school in Jerusalem is the right date. The Sephardic rabbis have no problem. The Ben Ish Chai is the right date, right? Not only does he not have a problem with it, he devotes his drasha telling the Jews of Baghdad to send their kids to the school. Okay, I'm going to give you some later examples which are not exactly the right date, but they're still the same thing. Okay, here's 3 examples. One was Rav Moshe Kalfon HaKohen, who was a revered Talmudic sage among non-Ashkenazi Jews. You've heard of him. He wrote an essay in the wake of World War I, which caused a lot of human trauma, about an international court for disputes between nations, which would also enforce arms control and would also be able to regulate how countries deal with ethnic and religious minorities. Okay, well, today this may sound like less of a good idea, okay, because you can see how international law gets turned into like anti-human rights, but that's not the point. It's totally not the point. The point is this. He sees tremendous human suffering in Europe. He sees nations making war and destroying the lives of millions, not just of soldiers, but also of civilians. And he also sees the nations of the world as having basic moral insights, which should be enforced. Okay? And so what does he suggest? Let's have an international court that will deal with all of these things. You can like the idea. You cannot like the idea. That doesn't matter. What matters here is this. No European Orthodox rabbi would ever in his wildest dreams write an essay like this. Where does it come from? Where does it come from? It comes from a person who has a traditional sense. Traditional sense, first of all, says chokhmah bagoyim ta'amin, right? If someone tells you there is wisdom among the nations of the world, believe them because it's true. Okay, this is a person who sees, Jewish tradition as something which is not, opposed to being involved in the world. And then this is a person who is a traditional Talmid Chacham. This is a person who wants to raise the next generation to keep Torah and mitzvot. And this is a person who's very dedicated to the people of Israel. Okay, and this is a person who all the people who like to talk about Orthodox conservative reform all the time. All of you would call him what? An Orthodox rabbi. And yet he writes an essay that no European Orthodox rabbi would ever dream of writing, because it's a different mentality. Okay, the best example, if we have enough time for it, is Rav Uziel. Okay, now Rav Uziel, you can see the dates. It doesn't fit chronologically, but it does fit mentally. Okay, it completely fits mentally. A big question came up in the Yishuv, in the Hebrew Yeshuva, Yeshuva Ivri, the Eretz Yisrael, Zionist pioneers. A big question came up regarding women. Nothing to do with women in the synagogue. Rather, can women vote in the Yishuv? And can women be, help me, elected in the Yishuv? Okay, can women vote for office? And can women stand for office? Okay. Now imagine what this means. First of all, imagine what this means in terms of Europe. Okay, women's suffrage came in very late in Europe. There's some countries, I think, till the 1970s. Okay, a woman didn't get the vote. And here, the Zionist Yishuv is doing this like in the 1930s or something. Maybe the 20s. I don't remember what the date was. Okay, and they're voting on it very, very early. And there are elements, okay, which are traditional also in the Zionist movement. And they were furiously opposed to this idea of women voting and women being elected, which were two related but ultimately separate questions. The most famous person who came out about women not being allowed to vote and not being allowed to be elected, anyone know who it was? None other than Rav Kook. Okay, it's forbidden. Okay, it violates the modesty of the Jewish woman.
They go for the German Kinder.
Yep.
Well, again, what?
The German phrase.
Yes.
Kinder. Women's proper role.
In the kitchen, the church,
Church, children, and the kitchen.
Church, they said it. Church, children, and kitchen. Very nice. All right. Well, Rav Ben Zion Chai Uziel, you can see his dates here. He was chief rabbi from 1939. Remember that the chief rabbin was created before the state of Rose, until 1953 when he died. And these years are very meaningful, meaning the Holocaust very much impacted the things that he did as chief rabbi. So he was confronted with this question about women voting and women be elected. And it's so powerful that I want to share it with you in Hebrew. Of course, I'll translate. Okay, we open it up on Sefaria, where they have the responsa of Rav Uziel. And here it is. Zchut ha'isha beveit ha'morashim u'mosdot ha'anhala ha'tziburit va'yeshuvit. The right of a woman in the various institutions of the Zionist Yishuv and the priestly office. Can a woman vote? Can a woman be elected? This was asked to him. Okay, and he's not contemporary with Rav Kook. Rav Kook died before he became chief rabbi. Sheila zo הייתה לסלע המחלוקת בארץ ישראל, ומפניה הזדעזעה ארץ ישראל כולה. He says this question was the greatest cause of controversy in the land of Israel. The entire land of Israel shook at the time, he says, because of this question. I won't read it, I'll just translate it. He says there were placards and there were signs on the walls and warnings on the walls and booklets and pamphlets and essays and the newspaper articles every single day, okay, by rabbis who wanted to forbid the participation of women entirely in elections, meaning not even to vote. They rested their words, their opinions on the law of the Torah and on keeping modesty and on preserving the family unit and peace in the family. Maybe she'll vote against her husband, I don't know. And the opinion of all of them, meaning all of the rabbis, he says, was based on the saying, look at this, Chadash asur min haTorah. Anything new is prohibited by the Torah. That's what all these rabbis based their opinion on, he said. In other words, he said, what's really preventing them from allowing women to vote or be elected is not all of these things about modesty or whatever. It's because of this ideology that anything new is prohibited by the Torah. And if women didn't vote in the past, then women shouldn't vote now. Now, did women not vote in the past? There weren't elections in the past. Okay.
Men shouldn't vote either.
All right, what?
So men shouldn't vote either.
So men shouldn't vote either. But there's no choice. There's not. All right, but he's suddenly making fun of this. This is an idea. This is a fantastic Talmid Chacham. This is again someone who all of you would probably call Orthodox, but he just doesn't get the ideology. And since it's already the 1950s, he's already aware of it. He's aware that this ideology exists and that it doesn't make any sense to him, and he doesn't think it's part of the Torah. He says,
And all these rabbis all come from the same school, so of course they'll
think alike, but I don't, because I don't come from the same school, right? I come from an Arabic-speaking country rather than from Europe.
We have lots of elections every year.
No, wait, he's a Sephardi rabbi, chief rabbi.
Yes. Yeah, I should have said that. I'm sorry. Because if I don't say that, then the whole thing doesn't make sense. Right, he's the Sephardic chief rabbi. For anyone who didn't understand, I apologize. He says, to my great despair, he says, I cannot retrieve all the endless things that people wrote and said about this in order to give a full, discussion of the topic. But he's also making fun of it. They wrote too much about it. They said too much about it. Okay? But he has some book that sums it all up. Then he says, this whole thing can be summed up into two issues. The active, meaning can a woman vote? And being elected, meaning can a woman get elected? So he says, the first part, woman voting, there is absolutely no source which even deals with it. Doesn't exist, okay? And he says the following. He says, in these elections, what are we doing? We are electing the people who are going to be able to tax us, who are going to be able to, make us enlist in the army or our children, who are going to be able to set laws which we're going to be forced to follow, right? And they supposedly get their authority to do all of these things from the elections, right? So he says you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? If you won't give women authority to vote, then how can you think that women afterwards are going to be governed by the laws of these people who make all these rules?
Well, that's exactly what they expect today.
What?
That's exactly what they want today.
exactly what they want today? Who wants what?
Rabbis.
A lot of the Haredim.
We'll get to the Haredim of today very, very soon. So he says you can't do this. Okay. He says, how can we put the authority of the elected officials upon them if we remove from them the ability to vote? Then he says there are those who say that women do not have the they're not socially informed well enough to vote, to know what they're voting about. He says if that's the case, but what about men? He says there's plenty of men who also are not well informed enough to vote. How do we let them vote? Okay, then all right. So then he goes through all of the various his peace in the home and his modesty and whatever. And in the end, he comes to the conclusion that a woman need to vote. Okay, but what's most important here, at the guts of it, is he just doesn't identify with it. He just doesn't identify with the sentiments of all of these rabbis who made war against women who have the vote. He says, well, want to vote, let them vote. Like, what's the big deal? Okay, because things which are new are not forbidden by the Torah. Okay, and so you look at it, you see, what does the Ribono Shel Olam want? Does the Ribono Shel Olam want us to have women governed by people who they have not elected or not? Apparently not. Okay, and so, but that's a traditional outlook. It's not a modern outlook. It's a traditional outlook. It just doesn't look traditional to us. Now, to this very day, even now today, you're probably aware. Okay, what about the Haredi parties today? Do women vote?
In general, yes, but not within their own parties.
They don't even have
There's
pictures.
no women there.
Do women vote? I asked you.
Probably, they have to
Probably only
vote
if
for
their
whoever their
husband
husband told them
allowed
to
them.
vote.
The logic is like this. The logic is that an unfair system was forced upon us, in which women are given the vote for all of those parties. And if our women do not vote, then we'll be at an unfair disadvantage. Therefore, a Haredi woman will vote, not because it's right, but because it was forced upon us. But in the parties themselves,
They can't be elected to any position in the party.
elected to any position because the laws of the state do not force us to put women on the lists, right?
Remember, Rabbi Yosef was contemporary affairs, he knew him and all that.
Yeah.
He was the chief rabbi, and the chief
Yeah.
rabbis were chosen by the other. Why did it not carry on then? Why does Shas still not allow women?
All right, so the question is, why does Shas not allow women to vote?
Because they went to Ashkenazi yeshivas.
Yes, you're correct, Ashkenazi yeshivas. I think the answer with the Ashkenazi yeshivas is enough to sum up the two parts of this evening. Okay, what, in other words, what's going on? Rav Ovadia Yosef, you would think, should be part of the Rav Uziel trend, right? He should be keeping up with that. But what actually happened, that the Haredi Ashkenazic world, the black hat, I don't like the word Haredi, the black hat Ashkenazic world overwhelmed the Sephardic, a large part of the Sephardic world, which accepted the Ashkenazic ideology. And that's why you're asking me why Sephardic woman with Shas. Why don't you just ask a more basic question? How come all these Shas rabbis are wearing black hats? Did they wear them in Jerba? Did they wear them in Morocco? Okay. What this shows is that much of the population, even those who don't have Ashkenazic roots, they've accepted Ashkenazic ideology. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. So what do we have today to sum it all up in three short terms? You have anti-traditionalism, you have traditionalism, and you have tradition. Who are the anti-traditionalists?
Reform.
Reform, assimilationists, maybe to a certain degree, some of the Haskalah figures, although most of them were traditional. You have traditionalism, which is like the nothing changes in the Torah in Hungary, or the Torah in Derech Eretz of Hirsch, which was also a kind of ideology. Okay, and then you have tradition. And tradition is represented by people for whom modernity wasn't a cataclysmic trauma, like in Baghdad, or like Rav Uziel. Okay? So,
Do you think it would be
yes.
possible, like, chief rabbi, like a Rabbi Lowe, that's what the father.
Rabbi Lau, the father.
Have you seen that modern guy who's with it?
He was a modern guy?
Would he not come out with something like that and say the same sort of thing?
You think, first of all, you think Rabbi Lau was a modern guy?
I think he was more modern than some of them.
He was what's nowadays called like a modern Haredi.
Oxymoron, a contradiction in terms of.
No, there's a lot of people today who are calling themselves modern Haredi. It's like Haredim who get a job and they're a little more open-minded, but they still wear the black hat. And they still identify in some ways with the Haredi ideology. That's kind of like where Rav Lau was, the father.
There are even Haredim who dress in regular Western clothing, who have jobs and so forth.
If they dress in regular Western clothing, who are they?
And they say they're Haredim.
I bet they speak English.
I don't know.
The Americans.
Well, yeah.
The American
A
immigrants.
lot of the American immigrants are modern Haredi. And they don't, not all of them fully take the dress code. You know, when I went to high school, I actually saw the transition. When I went to high school, we were sarcastically called a gray hat yeshiva. Because not all the hats were black. You had to wear a hat, okay? But not all the hats were black. Nowadays in that yeshiva, right, all the hats are already black. What?
As a kid in America, you had to go around with one of those big hats.
Well, we were the students, okay? And so they encouraged us to wear a hat. And they said, if you want to be the chazan, you have to put on a hat, okay? But I was afraid of my parents, who are probably going to listen to the recording of this. I said to them, what would my parents think if I wear a hat like that? Okay, and they didn't force us. It wasn't a school rule. But all the rabbis wore it, and anyone who went in the right direction eventually ended up wearing a hat. Whatever.
No, that's the thing I always find difficult, seeing these young kids.
Yeah.
I mean, young teenagers walk around with big hats on.
Hats, yeah.
Teenagers, I see.
It's the dress code. We're off topic. Anyone who wants to leave can leave. But the hats,
No, they don't, it's still.
the dress code even in Europe didn't exist. If you look at Slobodki Yeshiva in the early 1900s, they're dressed, they're not dressed in like a yeshiva uniform. They're dressed like, a modern, well-dressed man.
I had a discussion with someone who was a speech therapist in Tzvi Hospital. And he was Babich from the States.
Yeah.
And Babich from the States very often were quite shocked when they came here and saw what Lubavitch was here.
Yeah, so it's like American
Haredi
Haredi meets Israeli Haredi. So Jenny's now saying American Chabad meets Israeli Chabad, and they get culture shock.
Yeah, because the schools that Chabad ran in most parts of the States to attract Americans.
Yeah, they
to
had
it.
secular
Actually, they had
studies.
high
and yeah.
standards for mathematics, for English literature, for science, for, general studies in addition to the religious studies. And so you come here and you see what the level of the Haredi schools were. And he was
Absolutely.
in shock.
Absolutely. So part of where it's reflected is the dress code. A minority of Haredim in America don't totally keep the dress code, but here they all do.
What's the difference between Haredi and Chardai?
Haredi and Chardal.
Chardal.
Not a Haskalah, it's a guy.
Huh?
Chardal is Kippah Sruga, but it's on the Haredi side.
It's Haredi, Chardal is Haredi ideology, except that it's Zionist.
Okay, so the guy who was standing outside the hair salon below my building.
Who stands
He was
outside the
wearing,
Harris?
yeah, he was wearing tzitzis, a muscle shirt, but no kippah. What was he?
I don't know what he was. I would sit this in no
Kids on
kippah.
the train going down.
I
to
see
Netanya this
soldiers.
week.
Yeah,
They're in tzitzit, they're wearing shorts, the legs are all tattooed,
yes.
tattoos on the necks and the arms.
Tattoo?
You know, you're saying
I-
that today in Israel we have all kinds of strange mixtures. Maybe that's a good sign that we're no longer so governed by these ideologies. But right now we're still in the ideologies.
I've also
historical.
seen a lot of soldiers
Yeah.
with tzitzit and no kippah.
Tzitzit
And I
and no
asked a
kippah.
friend of mine about it. Apparently, there's a new movement among soldiers
Yeah.
who otherwise never wore tzitzit
Yeah.
to wear tzitzit, but
To wear
they've never
tzitzit.
worn kippot all the time either, so they don't. do
Yeah,
that.
the kippah.
And I see it a lot.
If I was brave, I would take off the kippah. I'm serious.
Oh.
I would take off the kippah because you can be a better Torah Jew without a kippah.
You'd be better.
But there are tzitzit in the Torah, but nothing about a kippah.
Yes, the kippah though is different. The kippah is, it's a thing that I belong to. You belong to a certain group. Why should you belong to a certain group? You're Israel, right? You're a member of the people of Israel. So Yoav Sorek, I don't know if anyone's you've heard of him. Yoav Sorek. Yoav Sorek did this, right? He went to Zion, his yeshivot all his life, and he said one day, "I'm taking off the kippah to be a better Torah Jew." What does a better Torah Jew mean? Well, let's say I'm with my coworkers and we all go out to lunch, and I have a kippah. So they say, "Oh, because of the dos, we have to go to a kosher restaurant." Right? But if I have no kippah on, then what?
Then you can't go.
No. We have to go to a kosher restaurant because Yoav is here. Yoav keeps kosher not because he's a dos, but because he's a Jew. You get it?
Yep.
I
Okay.
was going to say the
Yeah.
thing that really surprised me once.
Yeah.
This young Ethiopian guy
Ethiopian guy would
who suddenly decides he wants to become Haredi in his mid-teens.
mid-teens,
And the next
becomes
time he comes
Haredi.
in, suddenly he's got the black hat on and the black suit and everything. That's not his, doesn't come from his background.
Gordon says an Ethiopian young guy who took on the whole Haredi uniform, yeah,
It's just to see him dressed like that when
and it's a shock.
the European.
So sometimes I daven in Yemenite Yemeni synagogue for my Yemeni
Yeah,
whole family.
yeah.
The difference between, and they're very, very traditional, they would be called Orthodox if they were European,
Yeah.
okay? So I go to the Yemeni synagogue with them, and everyone there is Yemeni, right? And everyone knows every prayer by heart. And they all do daven together in one long monotonous tone, right?
Right.
They got a 13-year-old boy standing up there to lead the davening, right? And a bunch of 13-year-olds around the back, right? And they're all wearing black hats and black suits. And you got men in their 20s in jeans and t-shirts. And this is on hot,
Yeah.
right? It's such a dichotomy.
It's such a mixture of ways to dress. You have the yeshiva uniform, and you have like a casual dress in a Temani synagogue. The way it happens is this: years and years ago, I was sent for Shabbat to Moshav El Yakim, right, where the El Yakim junction is, and it's a moshav the people from Yemen were sent to. And the rabbi there, wore a black hat. This was years ago. It's like 30 years ago. Okay. I asked him why he wore a black hat. You know what he said? He said, if I didn't wear the hat, They would, none of my colleagues would accept me as a rabbi. And that's where it,
Let
Then
me
that's
get
where it
back, let me get back
begins.
to this question about the
yeah,
Sephardi
yeah,
being subsumed within the Ashkenazi
Yeah.
structure.
yeah.
So it's
Ideology.
ideology, this structure,
Yeah.
well, it's a power structure, really.
Yeah.
I mean, they have basically given up their identity to become subsumed and become accepted.
Yeah,
You know, I see, there's a kind of a parallel here with the Black movement in the United States,
okay,
where in the century before the 1960s, let's say,
yeah,
if you were Black and you wanted to become accepted in society,
yeah.
you tried to become white. You tried to, you bleached your skin, you straightened your hair,
Yeah.
whatever was
You look the
involved.
look as much as
You
you could.
wanted to look,
Yeah.
and you accepted the mores and the dress and everything like
Yeah.
that. And it was only until the 1960s when the Black Power movement really began
Yeah,
that you began to see a different expression
yeah,
of this, you know, sort of a native expression. I don't know if you can use that word, but more of a true expression of their own culture.
right,
And it would seem to me that what's happened with the Haredi,
Yeah.
with the Sephardi religious culture, is that it's become subsumed and it's not.
You know what it
no
was,
longer has-
Don?
no longer
Don,
connect-
it's not only a matter of dress, it's also a matter of success. It's an extremely successful political movement. The way it became successful is by claiming that it was a Sephardic power movement. That's how it was marketed.
Right.
Whereas in reality,
The reality is, yes.
it was,
It was a total capitulation to.
Nachon.
Or assimilate, so.
No.
Becoming